Welcome to the Common Man Football Show. My name is James Coburn, and today's episode we're going to be talking about Jamison Crowder, the Washington Redskins wide receiver. He's someone that has gotten a lot of, I wouldn't say flack, but just a lot of arguments on the web, draft Twitter, etc., about what his overall upside is, what his potential is, what his production, in the future is going to be. There's a lot of people that view him as the number one wide receiver, at least potentially the number one wide receiver in the Redskins offense this year. And then there's also other people who don't view that at all and just think that he's pretty much going to do similar numbers to what he's done as sort of a complementary sort of wide receiver. Not necessarily a number one wide receiver, but like a number two complimentary type of guy. And I figured, you know what, let's get into Jamison Crowder. I always felt like he was a somewhat underrated wide receiver in the draft class that he was in. And there was some things on paper that were encouraging. There were some things on paper that were a little, a little worrying. But the bottom line is he did come out looking like a fairly decent prospect. And we're going to go over what his production looked like in college, what his athleticism looks like, and then, of course, what his production looks like in the NFL. And to just familiarize you with some of the terms I'm going to be discussing today, if you're not familiar with it, passing yardage market share production is where you take an individual offensive statistic, in this case passing yardage, and you divide it by the team total yardage. So if a wide receiver has 1,000 yards and a 4,000 passing yardage offense, that wide receiver had 25% passing yardage market share production. And what you do is you take that 25% market share score and you compare it to every single wide receiver since the 1969 NFL draft class. And then you're able to see where the multiple All-Pro players ended up in terms of market share, where the Pro Bowl players ended up, and of course where the bottom end starters, just the bare minimum long-term starters, ended up at least. So we're going to look at that. We're also going to look at athleticism data. Like I said before, we're looking at explosive lower body strength, speed, and flexibility. Explosive lower body strength is the vertical and broad jump measured against mass density. The speed score is a 40-yard dash measured against mass density, and then the flexibility score is a short shuttle / three cone measured against mass density. Mass density, by the way, is weight divided by height. And then the final thing we're going to look at is, of course, what his NFL production looks like, which is the same methodology as the passing yardage market share at the college level. It's just we're applying it to the NFL level. Unlike the college level, where I'm not going to be comparing him to wide receivers since 1969 because I haven't gone that far back yet in terms of my wide receiver data. However, I will be comparing him to at least all the wide receivers since the 2005 draft class, not draft class, but season in the NFL, which I figure is a pretty substantial sample size, to say the least. In terms of, and also you're kind of comparing them to how other players performed in the years that they played and that sort of thing. So with all that out of the way, let's get to what Jamison Crowder looks like in terms of his production in college, his athleticism, and of course what he looks like in the NFL thus far. Starting with his production in the college level. He had a 90.17 passing yardage market share production score. Now, it doesn't say 90.17. That's because it rounded down in terms of the software I was using for the chart. However, it's at least 90. I mean, that's basically rounding down for his market share production. And based on that information, he hit every single threshold you're looking for in terms of 5-time All-Pro wide receivers, 3-time All-Pro wide receivers, 3-time Pro Bowl wide receivers, and of course long-term starters. The basic way to think of these thresholds is that the vast majority, at least 95% of 5-time All-Pro wide receivers scored at least 85 or higher. 95% of 3-time All-Pro guys at least scored 80 or higher. 95% of 3-time Pro Bowlers at least scored 68 or higher. And then, of course, 95% of long-term starters had at least a 58 or higher in terms of their market share production score. And in Crowder's case, he hits at least the 5-time All-Pro threshold, which is good. It's really good to have a wide receiver who produces at that level. It's indicative of, it could be a guy who's just a starter, though. I mean, that's the one thing I want to just kind of add is that just because you produce like a 5-time All-Pro player, at least how the majority of the 5-time All-Pro players produce, doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to be a 5-time All-Pro player, because there's things like film and athleticism and stuff like that that also fits into the profile. However, it is good to have a production score like that. And based on his athleticism, this is the only area where he runs into a couple issues. He had a 52.21 explosive lower body strength score, a 38.67 speed score, and a 27.06 flexibility score. Based on my data that goes back to the 1999 NFL draft class, at least when it comes to athleticism data, almost 100% of multiple Pro Bowl and All-Pro players, with the exception of Chad Johnson, had at least one athleticism score that was 54 or higher when it comes to their athleticism data. And as you can see with Crowder's case, he doesn't have a single athleticism score that is above 54 or higher. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that he's doomed to be a terrible player. It's just that when it comes to his data, he has a profile more of a potential long-term starter than he does a multiple Pro Bowl or multiple All-Pro type of player, which, based on the data, is a very reasonable sort of conclusion to make based on Crowder's sort of profile. So the basics that you should be familiar with, at least when it comes to Crowder, when Crowder was coming out of college, is that he had very, very good production, about as productive as you could possibly want a wide receiver to be. However, his athleticism just didn't quite do it in terms of a multiple All-Pro / Pro Bowl player, which would give him long-term starter potential versus multiple Pro Bowl, multiple All-Pro potential. And again, we're talking specifically potential because, you know, potential is the P word. It's the word that gets people fired. But I don't think it's unreasonable at all to say that Jamison Crowder has the potential to become a long-term starter. I would just say it would be a little unreasonable to consider him to be a multiple All-Pro, multiple Pro Bowl player, considering that there's only been one player since 1999 to become that, in Chad Johnson, who did not have at least 154 or higher athleticism score. So that's the only thing I would say about Crowder, is that Pro Bowl potential, multiple Pro Bowl potential. I'm talking consistent Pro Bowls, 3 straight seasons or 3 seasons in a career worth of Pro Bowls is very hard to do, guys. Guys may go to 1, but 3 straight or 3 within a career is very rare. And that's the only thing I would not exactly expect for Crowder, is that sort of stuff. But he does at least have the sort of profile of a long-term starter. And when it comes to his NFL production, he shows up very nicely. He had a 67.24 market share production score in 2015, which is at least a top 60 to top 80 wide receiver in 2015. And in 2016, he had a 73.57 market share production score compared to his peers in 2016, and that is essentially a top, what's the best way, like a top 50 to 60 wide receiver in terms of his production in that season, just to put that into perspective. So he's pretty much been a lower end number 2 producer in terms of his production, market share production specifically, in the last 2 seasons. And the only other thing I would say, just to kind of cap this off, is the one player who's actually very similar to him in terms of not only his athleticism but also his production in college and of course his production in the NFL is Willie Snead. The Saints have a wide receiver named Willie Snead. You may be familiar with him, you may not, but they do compare very similarly. Snead is a little bit more athletic than Crowder. He's more explosive. He's a bit faster, but they have very similar flexibility scores compared to each other. On top of also having very similar college production, Crowder was a higher end sort of 90.14 was Crowder's college production, while Snead had an 85.25. But they both hit at least the 5-time All-Pro threshold for wide receivers. So they have very similar production to each other. And when it comes to actual NFL production, now Snead has been in the NFL for 3 straight seasons, while Crowder's only been in the NFL for 2 straight seasons. So Snead has a little bit of a leg up on Crowder because of that, but when you actually average their impact, you take all their seasons combined and then you average it out. They actually have very similar production as well. Snead is a little bit more productive. His average production for the seasons he was in the NFL was a 75.41 out of 100, while Crowder is a 70.41 out of 100. But the bottom line is, I think that this is probably the best sort of comp for Crowder. Snead is almost like a better version of Crowder because he is a little more explosive, a little faster, has the same sort of flexibility issues in terms of having below average flexibility. But I would say that Snead is kind of the higher end version of Crowder in terms of athleticism, while Crowder is just kind of what he is, and it's also shown up in terms of his production as well. So I would say the best sort of data comp again, is Snead to Crowder. I think that's the best sort of way to think about Crowder in the future. Is he's kind of a Willie Snead-esque type of guy, in terms of the lexicon of wide receivers that we talk about right now. That's how that would kind of work for Crowder. So in conclusion, what can we really say about Jamison Crowder? Well, the main thing I can say about him is that he had very good production coming out of college, at least indicative of a 5-time All-Pro player, potentially. And on top of that, his athleticism wasn't amazing. He did not have the athleticism indicative of a multiple Pro Bowl or multiple All-Pro type of wide receiver, with the exception of Chad Johnson. However, what I can say is that he has enough sort of athletic traits. He has above average explosiveness. He has, he isn't so terrible of an athlete. Like, there have been wide receivers that are less athletic than Crowder to become long-term starters. It doesn't, like, his athleticism is not like, oh, he's going to be terrible. It's just that his overall upside is capped a bit due to his athleticism, at least in terms of long-term upside. So I would say Crowder's best bet is to be kind of like a poor man's Willie Snead. He's sort of a slot receiver who is sort of that number 3, number 2 option in a very high volume type of offense. Because the Saints have a very high volume type of passing offense. The Redskins have a very high volume type of passing offense as well. So there's actually some commonalities, some things that are very similar between Kirk Cousins and Drew Brees, just in terms of how they produce and how their offenses work, where the quarterback is a centralized sort of figure and that type of thing. With the Redskins, running the ball a little bit more. But I would say that's the best sort of thing I could say with Crowder in the future, is that you need to value him as a top 50 to 60 type of wide receiver. If he stays in the situation that he's in right now, I would not expect him to become a 90 percentile or higher type of producer. That's just not his bag. If it were to happen one season, I just don't think it would be able to happen consistently over and over and over again in the future. I just don't think that would be the best case for Crowder in the future, is for him to become this top 20 wide receiver for a very extended period of time. Not to say that he couldn't do it once. He definitely has the ability to do it once. I just don't see him doing it consistently year in and year out for like 3 years in a row or within 3 years of his career. I would say that he most likely will just end up producing in the top 50 to top 60 or less sort of area as sort of a complementary piece wide receiver. And again, there's nothing wrong with that. I'm saying that this is a person who has a role and he should stay in that role. I'm just also saying that you shouldn't overvalue him because he does not have the athleticism traits indicative of someone that is going to become a multiple Pro Bowl type of player, nor has he put up the type of production of a multiple Pro Bowl or multiple All-Pro type of wide receiver in his NFL career thus far. So with all that said, my name is James Coburn. You can find my work at draftcoburn.wordpress.com in terms of the stuff I have a lot of stuff on there that you guys can check out in terms of quarterback data and just film grades, if you will. I graded over 1,000 players last year, so you can just type in a name and most likely a film grade will pop up for that player for the most part. If it doesn't, then you'll be sure to get some of those once the season actually starts. You can also follow me on Twitter at Geometrics, and if you like this content and you want more content like this, be sure to leave a like and subscribe. Share this video as well with anybody that you know, and I'll talk to you guys in the next video. Peace.